we ready? Okay. So my name is Jack Heyman. I'm a retired member of the Longshore Union here in San Francisco. Most of us work in Oakland. I want to welcome everyone here to the Labor Action Committee to Free Mumia Abu-Jamal Forum. And the title of the forum is The Fight to Free Mumia Abu-Jamal, the fight against U.S. racist U.S. capitalism. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the case, and Mumia is perhaps the most prominent U.S. political prisoner. He's been in prison since 1981. And we were able to get him off death row, but he's still in prison, as he calls it, on slow death row. He was imprisoned and framed up for the killing of a police officer in Philadelphia. And this evening, we're honored to have one of his strongest advocates. For 30 years, she's been a legal advocate for Mumia, Rachel Wolkenstein. And Rachel will make her presentation after I give a little bit of background about the LAC and our campaign for Mumia. So I think most of you know that this bookstore is the bookstore of the Communist Party, Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. So in a way, it's interesting because this is the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So what more appropriate place to have a forum like this than in a Marxist library, bookstore. So the Russian Revolution was actually the first successful workers' revolution. And I don't know if they sell the book here, but perhaps one of the most popular books about the Russian Revolution is John Reed's The 10 Days That Shook the World. It's one that really moved me. John Reed is a West Coast, he's from Oregon, a journalist. He was a radical. He went to Russia during the revolution. He was an eyewitness to that revolution. And he wrote a stirring account in The 10 Days That Shook the World, and I encourage you to read that book. Because in the book, it points out very carefully that the leaders of the Bolshevik Party that made that revolution were Lenin and Trotsky, and that they were the ones that argued with the rest of the Bolshevik Party that the time was right to insurrect and take state power, when the majority of the Bolshevik Party was actually opposed to that position. So Reed lays it all out, very detailed fashion, and a stirring account of the Russian Revolution. That revolution inspired other revolutions throughout Europe, and not only revolutions, but general strikes, occupations, sit-ins, all sorts of strikes were taking place. And in a few years after the Russian Revolution, the capitalist repression had been so effective that it wiped out two worker states. The Bavarian Revolution actually set up temporarily a worker state, as did in Hungary, led by Bela Kun. So probably the worst repression that took place after World War I, inspired by the Russian Revolution, was in Germany, where the Free Corps murdered Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. But we also had repression in this country after World War I. And that was at a time when the first black longshore union official in an integrated union in the port of Philadelphia was arrested. His name was Ben Fletcher. And he was arrested for his anti-capitalist and anti-war views, as was Eugene V. Debs, head of the Railway Workers Union, who actually ran for president on his anti-imperialist war and anti-capitalist program. So we have a history in this country of fighting against that kind of repression, and it got even more severe into the 20s when the Palmer raids took place. So the CP was just getting off the ground in this country in the late teens, early 20s, and they decided that the left was so split up in this country, kind of like what it is today, different left groups all over the place, that they decided that we have a common enemy, the capitalists. So let's form a defense committee. Let's call it the International Labor Defense. And so the ILD was formed in the early days of the Communist Party, and they took on cases regardless of what political affiliation you were. For instance, now the ILD, the early ILD was initially led by James P. Cannon. James Cannon took on the Sacco and Vanzetti case. It was the first really big case that the ILD took on. Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists that were framed for robbery and a murder. Long story short, the ILD was not successful in saving their lives. But that was an initial foray into the legal arena, and so later on, they took on the Scottsboro case, and they were effective in that case. So the important thing about the ILD, and the reason I'm bringing it up here, is that the Labor Action Committee bases its principles and its actions on what the ILD did. That is, and it's based on the principles that we have no confidence in the racist capitalist system. We have confidence in the working class to bring justice. And we also do use the capitalist courts to the extent that we're able to. But we don't have confidence in that. And that's why we believe in mass mobilization of the working class. In 1934, there were three major strikes. One was here in the Bay Area, led by my union, the Longshore Union. And each of these three strikes was greatly influenced, the leadership of those strikes, by different leftist organizations. The Longshore Union here in the Bay Area was strongly influenced by the same party that this bookstore is owned by, the Communist Party. Sam Darcy was the political mentor, and he was a leading figure of the Communist Party, of Harry Bridges. And so they led a very powerful strike that led to a general strike after the police killed two of the strikers, shot them in the back. Actually, we have two murals over at our Union Hall in San Francisco. One of them depicts on the sidewalk the bodies of two of the strikers, and it says 2 ILA. That's what the union was called back then, International Longshoremen's Association. 2 ILA men murdered, shot in the back, police murder. And that's, if you ever are in the Fisherman's Wharf area, you should stop by and see that mural. There's another mural of interest there. It's one that depicts a woman in a long coat with a notebook on her side. And then it says ILD. Almost everybody that goes into the hall doesn't know what the hell the ILD is. But the ILD is the International Labor Defense that was originally set up by the Communist Party in the very, very early stages. And that, it says Red Angel because it's a depiction of Elaine Yoneda Black, who was a member of the Communist Party and was responsible for the defense campaign to defend not only the strikers, the seamen and longshoremen, and the Teamsters, but also there were fascist goon squads going into the headquarters of the Western Worker, the newspaper of the Communist Party, rampaging through their offices and so forth. And so the ILD went to the defense of the strikers and leftists that were involved in the strike. So there were two other major strikes in 1934. The other was the Minneapolis Teamster strike. That was led by another radical organization called the Communist League of America, which later became the Socialist Workers' Party. They were Trotskyists. They were led by the initial head of the ILD, James Cannon, became a leading figure within the Trotskyist movement. And they advised the leadership of the Teamsters in running that strike. And they went up against the same kinds of figures that were here attacking the leftists. In Minneapolis, the fascists actually had a name for themselves. They called themselves the silver shirts, like the brown shirts in Germany. And the Union organized its own self-defense, workers' defense guards, to take on these fascists and defend the pickets, defend the strike, and they were quite successful in doing that. The third strike was led by A.J. Musty, who later joined the Trotskyists. This was in Toledo, Ohio, the Autolite strike. Now, some of you may have heard of A.J. Musty from the anti-war movement in the 60s. He was a big figure back then. So, these were the three major strikes, and the important point about this, it shook the pillars of capitalism. All three of these strikes were about the power of the working class. And the headlines in the Chronicle back then was, Bolshevik Revolution coming to America, crazy kinds of things. And that's the kind of atmosphere, the hysteria that was whipped up in 1934. Now, the original purpose of the ILD was to defend any leftist, regardless of your affiliation, if you're attacked by the capitalists. But something different happened in 1939. The leadership of the Trotskyist Party and the leadership of the Teamsters that had only a few years before led the Minneapolis Teamster strike was imprisoned just before World War II under the Smith Act. It was an anti-communist act. But the Communist Party, by then, it was a Stalinist party, and they didn't see the Trotskyists as part of the communist movement. They had a very sectarian approach. And so they did not come to the aid of the Trotskyists. A few years later, after the war, guess who was the victim of the Smith Act? Yeah, the Stalinists. The government came in and went after the leadership of the CP, of the Communist Party. And that's why if the working class had adhered to the original concept of the ILD, that we defend each other regardless of what party you're in, we're more able to make a solid defense for each other. And this is kind of what's happening today. So the LAC has gone to the defense of some of these Antifa folks that have been protesting against the fascists. And we worked with the Longshore Union, and maybe some of you know about this, that August 26th, the Patriotic Prayer Group was going to have, they're a fascist group. Yeah. They're responsible for killings up in Portland, Oregon. Mm-hmm. And they were going to have a rally here in San Francisco. And our union voted that we're going to shut down all the ports in the Bay Area. We're going to march on this rally. We're going to stop it because it's not a question of free speech. Fascists aren't about free speech. They're about cross burnings, they're about lynchings, they're about killing leftists. And this is what came up at the union meeting. I'm just reporting back to you. And the members decided, no, we're not going to allow these fascists to have a rally in San Francisco. We put it out into the media, and we heard the day before that the fascists had decided to call off that rally. So we considered that a victory. So anyway, in the context of all this fighting the fascists that are happening today, I want to introduce our next speaker, who's going to give you a little bit of detail about what's happening now with the Antifa and people who are standing up against the fascists. So our next speaker is going to be Gerald Smith, who's a member of the Labor Action Committee to Free Mumia. He's also a former member of the Black Panther Party and the Oscar Grant Committee. Gerald?
Thank you very much, Jack. Okay. Ooh. You know, I was thinking when Jack said, he said, oh, they was going to kill all the leftists. I said, actually, every black thing in America would be in trouble. Every gay person, disabled. In fact, I visited a concentration camp that they turned into a museum when I was in Germany. And I started seeing all these different, they had the uniforms that the prisoners wore. So you had the yellow star for the Jews, red star for the Social Democrats and the Stalinists. Then they had a purple star, that was for the gypsies. A pink star was for, right? So part of our job, I think, is to recognize that they're genocidal and that we can organize the intended victims of these fascists to smash them asunder. And we have. They've been run out everywhere they go. After Charlottesville, the next weekend, now I'm going to tell you, this is how quickly consciousness can change. I was talking to workers, and this is the ugly truth. I'm talking to workers, I said, look, so what do you think? What's going on with it? Brother said to me, said, look, you know what? I hope that the goddamn Antifa and the Nazis kill each other. Wrong answer. Now I'll take it another step. When I was at the Longshore meeting, right, and we were trying to organize for this, you know, for this work shutdown in March on Christie Field, one brother, Dre, said, oh, this I don't know about this fascist. This is just white folks fighting each other. We ain't got nothing to do with this. Well, I don't know, but if you look at an excellent documentary on Charlottesville by a group called Vice, I don't generally endorse their political vision, but this particular documentary shows they caught this little black brother named DeAndre Harris, who was kind of, you know, when you go to demonstrations, stay with your people.
Yeah.
He got separated from us, so they tried to beat him within an inch of his life. It's ugly, but very real for those who don't understand the true danger. So when Jack talked about the history of class struggle defense, which we adhere to, I think it's also, I just want to touch briefly and just say, it started with this Joe Hill. They had a mass movement for Joe Hill, who was framed up for murder. And once again, while it's true that Joe Hill was executed, he was shot, what happens is the next time you're just a little bit more ready. You know who to go, to, how to organize. That's why questions of program and tradition matter. Mumia's generation of political prisoners, largely in America, I think, besides Gilbert, who was a white anti-imperialist, there is actually most of the political prisoners that come to my mind were former Panthers. Herman Bell,
Leonard.
Sunyata Kohli, excuse me?
Leonard Peltier.
Leonard Peltier, that's AM, the American Indian movement. But that generation has basically shot their wad in more ways than one. There is a new generation of class war prisoners now. Among them, for instance, the eco-terrorists, right? Animal liberationists. And you're going to get a sense of what it means when these people say that you are a terrorist. When they label you some kind of terrorist, they don't have to regard their normal bourgeois legality. So, for instance, there were some kids that did some graffiti, death to the fascists. They were arrested and charged with a hate crime. Well, what that means in reality is that if convicted, they don't get maybe 6 months or 3 months for graffiti. They're going to get enhanced sentences of up to 5 to 10 years for a hate crime. That's why you can never have confidence in the 1%'s judicial system. So now we have our anti-fascists on the line. And as you see, we come out with this slogan, drop the charges against the anti-fascist protesters now. Drop the charges. Very important, because this is the new generation. These are the young people that are becoming political right now. And we are beholden to come to their aid, to their assistance. The Labor Action Committee understands that the best way to free class war prisoners is a vigorous legal defense support movement so that the anti-fascist arrestees never become prisoners in the first place. It's serious. Look, how serious is it? Okay. Let me show you, just give you a quick rundown. June 26, 2016, there was a major demonstration in San Francisco. The Traditionalist Workers' Party was and is attempting to regroup all of these various Nazi fragments, the Golden State skinheads, the KKK, the Grand blah blah blah, all the well, actually that's dangerous, because unified they would be stronger. The young people came to me, they said they was going to do so. I said, that's you doing the right thing. Smash the meeting asunder. I helped them build a meeting. The counter-protest, they had 500 people there. They smashed the meeting of these Nazis. Now at that meeting, at that mobilization and counter-mobilization, we took some hits. About 11 people were stabbed by the Nazis. Remember, they get these guys from prison. They know what that's what they do. They stab each other a lot. Our people simply weren't ready for it. But we won. Let's don't get confused here. We won. We smashed their meeting. That's it. Be clear, all right? Yes, we took some casualties. Shut up, boy. Look here, I'm talking to the phone. But look, what's important is the fact that we were victorious. Now, as a result of that, 3 people were arrested. One of whom is Yvette Felarca. We were expecting her. The bail was $20,000. $20,000. The bail for Mike Williams of the Brown Beret, $250,000. And also Mike Porfirio Paz was also among those arrested. You'd have to know, we want to put out an electronic petition. And we want that petition to say the following. We call for all charges against the anti-fascist protesters to be dropped, with white supremacist provocations and violence rising sharply in California and across the country. Those who oppose them should be defended, not jailed. That's basically the petition, okay? Think about it. If you support it, I'm not hard to reach. I go out of my way to get back to you. I answer my phone. This is a small step that we can take together. And it's a step, I think, in the right direction. The word solidarity is more than a word. Thank you very much. I finished now. Come on up, Tanya.
I'll be fairly brief, but I'm Tanya, with By Any Means Necessary, and I appreciate the defense efforts and absolutely for the online petition. Just so background, that arrest that you saw of Yvette most recently, the political targeting there was a protest, an immigrant rights protest against Joey Gibson from the Patriot Prayer, the group that Gerald had explained was responsible for the Oregon murder. The police were escorting the Nazis to march to People's Park. And Yvette was with other immigrant rights folks, chanting for Sanctuary City and so on. So, and the background on Sacramento, 2016, she was one of the protesters there against the Nazis who was stabbed and then targeted. You now have these neo-Nazi groups online bragging about having stabbed people on video, and no charges have been brought against them, yet the 3 anti-fascists from the day have charges. She has successfully, as people know, and many people have supported and been part of, fought off attacks on her job and right-wing troll attacks, as have many other, progressive professors and anti-racist organizers facing this kind of attack that Trump has emboldened across the country. So just also in terms of what we can do, I wanted to make sure people know I did put some, thank you for the defense flyer from Gerald, I put some flyers with the court dates for the anti-fascists coming up at the back table. The Berkeley 5 have a court date in downtown Oakland this Thursday, November 2nd, and there's information of supporting them. There's on the back, Yvette Felarca's next court date in Sacramento is just a week from then on November 8th. And it's really important that we all stand together, whatever our political differences, to defend the anti-fascist organizers, and especially politically well-known and visible leaders like Yvette Felarca. As a Filipino woman, she has been just absolutely targeted by these big guys, these thugs, harassing her, threats, this kind of crap that Trump has emboldened. And so things people can do, obviously, the petition, attending the court dates. I also have information on the flyer about if you want to help fund her defense campaign, the go how to make donations. And finally, just in terms of ways we can unite over the next time period to stop Trump and defeat him is, I think, also something that she's been very focused on, building this fight to defend and enforce sanctuary cities with our own action. We have, been doing a Don't Walk On By if you see the ICE, and defend DACA, and basically stand together. What Trump has only is his racist, bigoted, misogynist scapegoating, right? But his attack on immigrant rights, that's all he has, but it's also his weak point. If we can stop him from getting away with deporting millions and doing a racial purge, which we can, if we can come out every time they try to bring ICE into town, and we've gotten at our hotline in the last week several calls that we have, investigated and gone out. We stand together for immigrant rights against racism. We defend, drop the charges on all the anti-fascists. We've got the vast majority on our side. He's got the racism, divide and conquer. That's all he's got. We can really enforce with our own action a movement to say no neo-Nazis marching on People's Park or anywhere in our communities, and defend political protesters, leftists' right to protest. So thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Tanya. So what we're going to do now is hear from the lawyer for Mumia, the labor advocate for Mumia. For over 30 years, she's been on the case. She's been diligently fighting for Mumia's freedom. When others were saying, we want a new trial, Rachel was there saying, the man has to be to free Mumia Abu-Jamal. So, brothers and sisters, our next speaker, Rachel Wolkenstein.
I want to, first of all, thank the LAC very much for inviting me here, and also to not just commend the work of the LAC since 1999 to free Mumia, but to make a point that actually the LAC is the only existing organization in the entire United States, and perhaps the world, that actually conducts labor defense work in this way in terms of building support based on the trade union movement. There were some other organizations, like the organization I was associated with for about 30 years, the Partisan Defense Committee, that used to do that. But the LAC is literally the only organization since 1999 who's actually gone out to the trade union movement and gotten support from trade unionists, trade union organizations around the world in defense of Mumia, for Mumia's freedom, on the Hep C question, and actually the only demonstrations that took place in the United States, despite the absolute urgent call for political action to get Mumia the Hep C treatment, was initiated by the LAC. So that is a statement of commendation to the LAC and a statement of sort of horrific situation in the left in the United States. Both things are equally true. All right, so I too am going to start with some points about the October Revolution. This is the 100th anniversary of October. And I make that point because Mumia's case has a lot of connections to this, as I'll go through and explain, but it's important to make this point about the October Revolution. So that was a proletarian revolution led by the Bolshevik Party in Russia, and it was not made only and solely for Russia, but it was seen as the opening of a necessarily international fight of labor struggle against capital. And it was a call for all exploited and oppressed around the world to prepare for battle. And in the United States, there was a much sympathetic response amongst workers and black people, and in fact, the beginning organizations of the international communists was formed in the United States. It was, in fact, however, the Communist International, led by Lenin and Trotsky, that argued that the American labor movement had to embrace the centrality of the fight for black freedom as part of labor struggle. And that the situation of black people in the United States was not just subsumed under a fight between labor and capital, but necessarily involved the defense for equal rights for blacks. And prior to this, the trade union movement, developing trade union movement in the United States was either, in some instances, few instances, actually hostile to black freedom, and others were agnostic to it. And even the great Debs, Eugene V. Debs, who was no racist, felt that socialism had, quote, nothing special to offer black people. So it really, in some ways, the development of consciousness in the left, in the working class left in the United States about the importance of the struggle for black revolution came from outside the United States, from the Communist International, and that's important for everyone to understand, and how important, one of the many reasons the October Revolution was so important. Now, in the period in post-World War II, the Soviet Union, who survived through that, despite the fact that the United States and the other allies did their best to make sure that the Nazis did destroy the Soviet Union and hoped for there to be a collapse there. The Soviet Union became a counter in the post-World War period to the emerging U.S. imperialism as the sole main imperialist power in the world. And it was basically at the same time that was going on, in the United States, there was a growth of actually U.S. police at home simultaneously with, McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI that first was started against communists, then, black civil rights, and of course, including Martin Luther King, and of course, the Black Panther Party. The Soviet challenge to the U.S. hegemony in the world also, in part, used part of its propaganda to attack the hypocrisy coming from the United States as being the bastion of democracy. And they pointed out the civil rights movement, which was, unfolding in the United States, and black people being shot and killed and bombed and in the United States. And from there was a huge pressure because our courts are totally sympathetic and reflective of the social conditions that are going on in the country. And it's actually important to understand that some of the progression of democratic rights in the 60s and the 70s actually came from the pressure on the U.S. government writ large from the Soviet Union and its position. So Brown versus Board of Education, in part, came from that. I'm not saying directly, but in terms of the influence. The same thing as the establishment of First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, Sixth Amendment rights, all the things that we know of is the Bill of Rights and constitutional rights. And I just want to stop and indicate that those rights, which are in the Bill of Rights, from 1789, did not become law for the states and the people involved in the states of the United States until the 60s, and each in separate different ways. And despite a civil war and the Reconstruction Amendments that abolished slavery and gave the right to vote to former slaves, that in fact those rights that should have been by that point applied to all the states as part of a victory of the Civil War were never implemented, even even facially as a legal right until the 60s. When I went to law school, which was in 1970, I thought that this had all existed for eons and eons. And in fact, it was newly made, and then as things progressed and undermined and eroded by the way the court system does work. So I do want to make this other point, which is that counter-revolution in the USSR in 1992 was an unprecedented defeat for the working people internationally. Despite, I'm a Trotskyist, I consider myself a revolutionary Marxist and a Trotskyist, but defense of the Soviet Union, which still had abolished capitalism and did not have capitalism, as far as I'm concerned, until 1992, basically meant that you had a buffer and a fight against U.S. imperialism, all its viciousness and all its depredations around the world until counter-revolution. And it changed the entire landscape of the world, and it changed the world that we are living in right now. And September 11th actually would not have happened if there was a Soviet Union. It would have happened. And so the war on terror, all these other things. So U.S. imperialism afterwards proclaimed itself to be, a one superpower world, and it, paved the way for fundamentalism and the world across the world, and in every religion, that we deal with. Now, I want to make a point that basically, given what we've gone through in the post-Soviet years, from Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, which, while they were different, and we had horrific positions about various, and I don't have the time to go through all of them, they are a continuum. However disgusting Trump is, however sick we get every time we do this stuff, he is substantially in his politics and policies and what he's doing no different. He's just more grotesque, he's just out there in your face, and the situation demands for us massive social and class struggle against racist U.S. capitalism now more than ever. And while we don't have, in my opinion, a party to all turn to, whoever you are and whatever organizations you come from, there is not a Marxist Leninist party to actually win and recruit people to the struggle for black liberation, the struggle for socialist revolution in this country. And I'm here to impart to say, I'm here to speak to, is the fighting for Mumia's freedom is in fact a part of the necessary fight we still need to do to struggle every day, to develop consciousness, to make the understanding that you cannot reform the American racist capitalist system. Can you show that little video that you had to go back to the movie? Here. Okay, so in the history, Jack spoke to a little bit. I'm not going to repeat by any means all that he said, but I want to make the point that in the history of U.S. cases and causes of class war prisoners, these prisoners have defined certain political generations. In the post-Civil War period, I would identify the following as sort of leading to mass movements that represent the social struggles that were going on in the period. There's a Haymarket, that was the fight for the 8-hour day. There was Sacco and Vanzetti, which was post-World War I. They were anarchists. They were part of the whole, Red Squad, Red Terror that was going on, and especially a reflection of the move against anarchists, against the Russian Revolution. There's the Scottsboro Boys case, which was the Communist Party going to the South, actually, and in the ILD, which was then run by the CP, it was no longer run by James P. Cannon, who was a Trotskyist who left because of the Stalinization of the international communist, the Communist International. But the Scottsboro Boys actually was a fight that actually dealt with the whole question of black oppression, and in particular in the South, and actually was a fight against the lynch law. And in the course of that struggle, as a legal thing, just to appreciate that, was a fight for the first time to have attorneys appointed for people who couldn't afford any capital cases. And then there's the Rosenberg case, which was post-World War II with the ascendancy of the Soviet Union, with the hysteria about the Soviet Union getting the bomb, which was supposed to be only for the use of the United States. And it led, of course, it was the whole McCarthyite period in the United States and the growth of the whole level of witch hunt and COINTELPRO and everything like that. Now, Jack made the point that except for Sacco and Vanzetti, who was making this point, all of these people who were heroes and people who were defended and represented mass movements internationally coming out of the United States were all executed, except for the Scottsboro Boys, who nonetheless spent most of their entire lives in prison. Now, the point is when you have a social fight and you're fighting against the government who's going after the people who are viewed as sort of representative or the actual people, sometimes only the representatives of struggles that are going on or fears that the government has, you fight and you fight hard, but you lose. You lose in terms of the particular, but you hopefully learn lessons. Now, I believe very strongly that Mumia is the defining case of our generation, or actually probably two generations, given the amount of time this has been going on, where all these other cases were were begun, fought for or never, and resolved by the execution of these people within a much shorter time than the 35 years that Mumia has been imprisoned. And I would say the major international campaign for him probably began in 1988, 89, when my organization at that time took up the fight. But he is, I believe, the case of our generation, and that Mumia's life, it was said, was saved twice from execution from the mass international campaigns that had, particularly in 1995 when the first death warrant was signed against Mumia, and again in 1999 when the second warrant was signed. And in that case, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations, of every sort around the world protested for Mumia and defense of Mumia to prevent his execution. A lot of them were based on trade union organizations, leftist organizations, civil liberties organization, and all that. Now, we know, it's been said, and we all know, freedom was not won. It would have been better if we had won it, of course. He was sentenced in December, was taken out of death row in December of 2011 and put on what he calls the slow death row of life imprisonment without parole in Pennsylvania prisons. And that decision to put him on a death row came because after 4 different attempts in the courts, both Pennsylvania and federal courts, including to the United States Supreme Court, Mumia had sort of won and had to defend the fact that his death sentence was overturned. His death sentence was actually overturned in December of 2001. But it took another 10 years, all the while he stayed in solitary confinement on death row, with all the limitations, which I don't have time to go through, that he stayed still on death row while this case went up to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, that's the Federal Appeals Court twice, and to the U.S. Supreme Court twice. And Mumia's, the judge's decision that said that his death sentence was illegal was upheld the last time, or not overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the remedy was not that he went free, not that he would for sure not die, but the state had the possibility of having a new actual hearing, they call it a trial, but a hearing to actually decide whether he would get a new death sentence or he would get a life imprisonment sentence. And even though that was the limited thing that was available legally, there was a deal that was made. A deal that was made because the state was absolutely afraid that if Mumia was brought into court again in Philadelphia, all hell would break loose, because it would be, symbolic. He would be there. It would be an outpouring of people being opposed to another legal proceeding in which a death sentence was in question. And instead of having a hearing and risking that, in fact, there would be somehow new evidence would be brought out in that way, even though technically they would not consider it, but all the publicity about it, they made a deal that Mumia would just be sentenced to life imprisonment and not have this hearing. Now, I wept tears of relief, I have to tell you, when I heard that. On the other hand, because he wasn't facing death anymore. On the other hand, I was furious, because this man should have been freed. And so I did not, I was not one of the people who screamed, this is a victory, this is a victory, this is a victory. It was good he wasn't going to die. It was horrible that he was sentenced to life imprisonment. So basically, this was done, and I'll go through the cast of characters later, but one person, two people, two elements I want to say. Who helped broker this deal was Edward Rendell. Okay, Edward Rendell, I will tell you a sentence about this. Edward Rendell was the district attorney when Mumia was convicted and sentenced, arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. Edward Rendell became the mayor of Philadelphia. Then he became the governor of Pennsylvania. Then he became the head of the DNC.
That's right.
Then he became, he was co-chair for who's presidential committee or something?
Gore.
For Gore. And he was on the short list when Hillary Clinton ran the first time to be on the possible VP list. And if you watch MSNBC, anybody, you will see that he is one of the liberal talking heads all the time on MSNBC. Okay, but that's Edward Rendell. So he, though he had no official position anymore, was on the podium, announcing that Mumia it was all agreed that he would simply spend the rest of his life in prison. Maureen Faulkner, the widow of Daniel Faulkner, who made her entire life working on behalf of the FOP and along with the Fraternal Order of Police and with the FOP, demanding Mumia's execution at every stage, basically said, okay, I'm conceding this because I know he'll rot in jail for the rest of his life, and I really hope that all the vicious other people there in prison will actually do him in. She basically called on other prisoners to execute him. Okay, so the title of this forum, I'm finally getting into it. Fight for Mumia's freedom is a fight against racist capitalism, American capitalism, and the fight is part of the struggle against American racist capitalism for many reasons. It's a fight actually that basically emphasizes the question of the state. The question of the state, the nature of the capitalist state, the nature of the American justice system, injustice system, and it's also the struggle for black liberation. All of those things are part of the reason why a fight for Mumia's freedom is going to be something that is going to be a way to fight against many aspects of what American capitalism is like. Right, Mumia's case is simultaneously, it's two things at the same time. It is an exceptional and extraordinary political persecution of an innocent man. That's one. And the persecution of him being both a political persecution is based on a number of things. This man, who you saw at he was age 90, he was age 30, about 32 in that video, was a Black Panther Party spokesman and writer at the age of 15. He was targeted by COINTELPRO, by the FBI, as somebody who, quote, despite his young years, should be put on the ADEX file, which was the file that you named for the people who were going to be rounded up in the case of national security and put into concentration camps. And he was basically targeted for death and extermination from the time he was 15, not when he was found on the street in December 9th, 1981, but from the time he was 15. Now, Mumia also, from the time he was 15, later he was with the Panthers. He left the Panthers for a while. He came back to Philadelphia, and by the time he was 20 years old, he was a known radical journalist known as the voice of the voiceless. He was primarily a radio journalist. He is the most beautiful voice, and if you haven't heard it, you should hear it. He has a cadence like Paul Robeson, not accidentally, by the way. And he basically was known when I started working on his case, which I said was 1987, 88, and went to Philadelphia the first time. They actually started learning more about Mumia. You would go all over the city. You would meet people. Now, this was already, 15 years later. 10 years, whatever it was. And people all knew who he was. They'd all heard him. He was totally followed in the black community and everything. And he was not, it was about, he did, you know, he got some award for covering the Pope's visit at some point. He interviewed Jules Irving. He did Bob Marley. He did Ossie Davis. He did lots of things. He talked about police brutality, of course. He talked about what was going on in every possible way over issues of black and brown and poor people and everything like that. So that's why he was the voice of the voiceless. But he also became one to the MOVE organization. And if there's an organization that's Mumia's organization, it is the MOVE organization. And he says in the same video, he says, I was won to MOVE by their, you know, kindness and beauty and all that sort of stuff. He was one to them. That became his political organization because he saw them as fighters against black oppression, even though it was and is still formally a multiracial organization. And they were under attack by the police. And he came out in support of them, and this was well known in the whole journalist community. He lost his job as a journalist, and he became more and more ostracized by the journalists in the formal journalist milieu as being somebody who was, had gone over the edge. And he began wearing dreadlocks. Okay, so most everybody in this room is old enough to know that back then, nobody had dreadlocks. This is not for any of you younger people where you see dreadlocks as just another hairstyle. Nobody had dreadlocks except MOVE and Rastafarians, and Rastas generally had their dreads up in a hat. So Mumia started growing dreads. I mean, that already was there. Anyone with dreads in Philadelphia was a MOVE member and a MOVE supporter. Now, he opposed the harassment of MOVE. And the MOVE desk, by the way, in the DA's office was run by Ed Rendell in a lesser degree. I mean, I cannot make this stuff up. These are all the connections that are here. And they advocated, MOVE organization advocated the right to self-defense, as did the Panthers. And in fact, when they were arrested in 1978 for this whole onslaught on their commune, in 1978, there had been, the area had been barricaded off by the police for over a year, and then they carried shotguns that didn't work. They didn't work. I mean, which to me is not the smartest thing in the world, but they marched around their porches with shotguns which had the mechanisms taken out of them. But the cops basically used that as an excuse to basically demand that they leave. They didn't leave, and they were fire hosed. There were children in there, people in there. The water went up. I've talked to many of the MOVE members. Children were on parents' shoulders so they didn't drown from the fire hoses in the building. And before there was Rodney King, there was Delbert Africa.
That's right.
Delbert Africa was a MOVE member, another former Panther, by the way, who was a MOVE member. And when he came out on the street with his hands up when they left the house, he was beaten savagely. And that's also on this video. It's on other videos, too. You see him literally being beaten in the head and jumping, being forced up like that. It's just horrifying. And that was taped. Nobody, of course, none of the cops were ever... they were charged but never convicted of this. Okay, Mumia defended them. Mumia was targeted by Rizzo, the infamous head of chief of police, later mayor. He was mayor at the time, I believe, and Ed Rendell was the DA who sort of personally attacked him. So all of these things, he was sentenced to death also. The other reason, in fact, one of the reasons we were drawn to Mumia's case and started defending him, because to our knowledge, he was the only person that we were aware of who was sentenced to death, literally because of words that he spoke and political beliefs he had when he was 16 years old. So at his trial, when he was age 26, the DA brought in a clipping that was in the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer in, I think, December of 1968 or 69. It was right after Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed. And there was an interview with Mumia, and you've probably seen this picture someplace, this young kid carrying a short afro, sitting in the Panther Panther headquarters with all these posters on it. And they quote Mumia on the front page of the Inquirer about the Panthers. And he talks about the Breakfast for Children program. He also talks about the fact that, this is the point, 38 Panthers had already been murdered by the cops and the FBI. And he had just come back from seeing the room and the door where Hampton and Clark were, the gunshots had gone in to execute them while they were sleeping. And he said, Panthers, we have to face reality. We have to face the reality of what the American government is doing to us. He said, political power to the people. And he said, as Mao said, he may not have said as Mao said, but he said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And what he meant by that is political power going out of the barrel of a gun was the U.S. capitalist class doing this in COINTELPRO. And these quotes from Mumia were put into the record before Mumia was sentenced to death by the DA, and it was used to argue intent, because they had no intent of why Mumia could have been the person who shot Officer Faulkner. They had no intent, except to argue, and this is what they argued, that his intent to kill a cop, always want to kill a cop, comes from when he was a 16-year-old Panther and he said these things. So we partly took up this case about the death penalty and all those things. When Mumia was arrested, the headline of the paper, of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the main bourgeois paper, said, the accused, it said the victim, 26-year-old cop, and then it had this other banner that said, the accused, eloquent journalist who's not afraid to raise his voice. Okay. That sounds like a headline you put in the paper if you thought this person actually was, quote, a cop killer. And the shooting that happened was supposed to be an execution-style shooting. Mumia standing over this cop, one leg on one side of his body and pointing down at the cop and hitting him, shooting him right between the eyes. So that gives you a sense of what Mumia's reputation was at that point. Okay, so all of these things are all the reasons that partly make Mumia's case so exceptional, so extraordinary, so clearly politically motivated over who he is, what he stood for, what he represented in that period. I want to make an equally important point, which is that Mumia's case is about the legacy of slavery. It's about the criminal justice system, which is totally racially biased. It's about basically a case that exposes the everyday workings of the inherently class-biased, racist, and politically driven criminal and justice system in this country. So I have a pet peeve, not just a pet peeve, about people who go around and argue that Mumia's case, there's a Mumia exception. That Mumia's case, and they use it, people come up with shorthand, there's a Mumia exception, other cases get decided in one way, but in Mumia's case, there's a Mumia exception because who he is. No, it's not a Mumia exception. There's a Mumia rule. And what they had decided against Mumia in the courts and the law that they've made about Mumia's case, they have used to use his case to actually pull back and withdraw and what little legal rights there have been in the criminal justice system. And I'm going to be way over time, but I also know that I can't go into all of those examples of them, but believe me, there are many. So basically, Mumia's case is about how the justice system, the criminal defense, criminal justice system is a frame-up system. It's a totally frame-up system. When Mumia was convicted and sentenced to death and was appealed his case, and it was primarily on cases of due process, a fair trial. The evidence was not an issue there. Why is a whole different story. But it was all the things, his right to defend himself, the right to a counsel, the right to have an unbiased jury. It could go on and on. Basically, every element of what should happen in a fair trial and due process was denied to Mumia in his case. And when this decision came out on his appeal, first time it was appealed in March 1989, the Supreme Court decision was really vicious and striking. I mean, we were already representing him. I was there when that appeal was argued the year before in the court, and it was shocking because we had a judge who sat on the Supreme Court who actually told the DA at that time, I don't want to hear any of your arguments because the argument you are making is something about what a prosecutor shouldn't do that we already overruled in a case before. That judge, when it came time for the decision, recused himself and did not participate in that decision. Now, Mumia said at that point, he said, law is politics by another name, and as one challenge after another was denied in state and federal courts, I mean, he's challenged his case at least a dozen times in one fashion or another, state court and federal court. Mumia repeated this other statement. In April 2009, when it pretty much appeared that he had no more appeals left, he said, the law is a tool of those in power, so how they use it doesn't depend on the law, it depends on power. You know, an apt statement. So, of course, we know, hopefully you know, that the power that we're talking about, the power of the state, is the capitalist state supported by all the state repressive apparatus, including the army, the cops, the prosecution, courts, and prisons. And then it's the politics of the two parties of capital, Democrats as well as Republicans. The law is the rules governing defense of private property and social relations in the private property system of capitalism. And the courts, you know, there's no justice in these courts. There's no fairness in the courts. And what they exist for primarily the bourgeois courts, is to adjudicate various disputes between elements of the corporations, private property owners, and everything else like that. And to put as many people in jail as possible when there's any either sign of problems or whatever, to put down strikes, to do whatever. In other words, it's a legal system that is in defense of capital in every possible way. Now, I have two little quotes I have to tell you that are my favorites, and explain to people who are, you know, less understanding of the points I'm talking about, but nonetheless I want to share them with you. One of my favorites about talking about the class relationship and class bias of the law comes from Anatole France, back in the early 1900s, who was a Nobel Prize winner and a staunch defender of Alfred Dreyfus. So he said, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under the bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. Okay, that is an analysis, I mean, as apt as you can of the class bias in the legal system. Okay, the other thing that has struck me, and I try to speak about this all the time, is a decision that came in 1987 while Mumia's first appeals were pending. And it's a case called McCleskey versus Kemp. And it was a huge effort by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and various other people to challenge the fact that there's a disparate number of black people who are sentenced to death. And it was a totally mathematically set forth thing going through. I don't have the figures around how many more blacks are sentenced to death than whites if the victim is black, if the victim's white, if it's black on black crime, if it's white on black crime, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was unequivocal that the statistics showed that blacks are much more disparately sentenced to death than white people. This was there in the courts. Okay, so what did the court say? The court basically ruled in this decision that the racial bias was proven by the statistical evidence. But it decided that that statistical evidence had to be considered irrelevant. And why was it irrelevant? This is how they said it. They said because otherwise, taken to its logical conclusion, this position would throw into serious question the principles that underlie our criminal justice system. I mean, how much clearer can it be? This is from the United States Supreme Court in 1987. How different is that in a certain way than what was said in the Dred Scott case in 1857? Black people have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Okay, so these encapsulate, you know, I think so amazingly the true nature of the American legal system. I mentioned that, Mumia's case was totally upheld in the direct appeal. That was the decision came out in 1989. And it was, truly horrible that this is what was done. We also know that in the course of later challenges to Mumia's case, I'm just looking for my note here so I don't lose my thing. Oh no, that basically, that the most important thing in terms of a frame-up and all the different rights, I mentioned all these due process rights that Mumia was denied in his trial. The most important due process right, which is not talked about as due process rights, by the way, is the right not to be framed up and to be convicted of something that you are innocent of. There is no right in this country not to be framed up. It does not exist, even if you are sentenced to death, even though death is different. And the Troy Davis case was a horrific example of that. There is no right to a reversal of a death sentence, let alone a conviction, if you are actually innocent, factually innocent of the crime, unless you can show some other constitutional violation. In other words, being convicted when you're not guilty is not a constitutional violation. Now, in Mumia's case, from the very moments after the shooting that night, or 4 o'clock in the morning on December 9th, 1981, the Philadelphia police, with the complicity of the Philadelphia DA's office and the United States Attorney's Office, manufactured evidence of Mumia's guilt. This was not something that was happenstance. It was not an accident. It was conscious. It was known. It was deliberate. Mumia happened on a scene in which I believe, and I'll explain this more later, it was intended to be appeared to be a shootout between various black people in which police officer Daniel Faulkner was going to be shot in the crossfire. And Mumia happened into that scene, having seen his brother, coming out of a car. Mumia was driving a cab at that point because he couldn't work as a journalist anymore. This was in the red light district, downtown area, the time to pick up lots of fares and everything, and that Mumia got caught. And when the cops saw him on the scene, they, quote, knew who they had. And this particular quote comes from the former head of the Black Panther Party in Philadelphia. They knew who they had. Remember back of the things I said. Mumia went in a 10-year period of time, from age 16 to 26, being known by every Philadelphia cop involved in, anti-Black Panther Party stuff, the journalist. This is only 10 years. Think of us older people. 10 years is nothing. They knew who he was. And I'll explain to you a little bit later about this. So all the evidence was totally a frame-up. The supposed gun that was used, that was Mumia's, how the shooting happened, the witnesses, the so-called confession Mumia made, all of it was a total lie, and all of it was known. So Mumia's innocence was suppressed, furthermore, and the suppression was, in fact, these facts of the threats, the witnesses who appeared at the trial. There was only one who actually said they supposedly saw Mumia with a gun and never actually said at the trial she saw him shoot it. It was a prostitute who actually learned was, doing tricks with the cops in exchange for being able to work the streets. She was threatened. She was afraid of her life. Another witness, and the witness who said they saw 2 people run away, was threatened with losing her children if she did not say that Mumia was the shooter. She instead said, well, I didn't see anybody run away. She couldn't quote it. She said, really lie on him that directly. But still, it helped make the prosecution's case. And then there was a confession that supposedly was not remembered for 2 months after this was made to hospital guards that night. They somehow missed doing it. And 60 days later, it gets reported to the police that Mumia confessed in the hospital when he was, by the way, shot. He was shot, almost dead, yes. He was shot, critically wounded, shotgun going through downward path through his liver and all the other stuff. And then he was beaten mercilessly by the cops at the same time and pretty much left for dead. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about this frame-up evidence, and we're going to deal with only one point. I could go on for many hours. And I'm going to talk about the confession of this man, Arnold Beverly. which did not become known really until 1999, when Mumia's basic appeals were already over. We'd already had a decision from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. We were getting ready to habeas corpus proceeding in federal court. I've had many different roles in Mumia's case. As I said, as a political activist, a legal advocate. But from 94, 95 through 1999, I was co-counsel for Mumia in the courts when we were challenging his sentence and his conviction before the infamous Judge Sabo, who was known as a hanging judge, and who put more people on death row than any other judge in the country, total supporter of the cops. So in 1999, I was able to interview Arnold Beverly, who I had met some 10 years before. And at that point, Arnold Beverly admitted that he had actually shot Faulkner. And he had shot Faulkner, and he was paid to do so by cops and the mob. At this time, a lot of people have found this has been a very controversial point of Mumia's, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it because I think how important it is. There were a lot of things in Mumia's case as we're working on it. Nothing made sense. As I said, the ballistics, the witnesses, there were supposedly, 3 people with Green Army jackets on the scene. Mumia didn't have a Green Army jacket. Mumia's brother didn't have a Green Army jacket. Faulkner didn't have a Green Army jacket. There were, despite the prosecution's case, that there were only 3 people there that night. And this downtown red light district at 4 o'clock when all the after-hour clubs were going on, according to them, there was Faulkner who stopped a car, there was Billy Cook, the brother, who got out of the car, there's Mumia who comes running, and Mumia shoots Faulkner, supposedly. 3 people. Well, in all the reports that are there were, like 6 different, taxis coming to the area. There were probably 20 other people that were on the street that night. There were, a lot of cops that are coming around. I make a joke sometimes that those corners were so crowded I wouldn't have been able to fit on there, actually, if you actually went through what stuff was going on. It was the reality. So a lot of things. Also the ballistics. They said that Mumia did this execution-style shooting right down to the sidewalk where Faulkner was lying prone. Only the ballistics reports and the pictures of the sidewalk did not show any markings in the sidewalk that would explain. There was no markings if you shoot and you had, all 5 shots were, only one of them hit Faulkner there, one was supposed to hit the back. Where there's no evidence that there were any other ricochets or making any marks on the sidewalk. I mean, these are just some of the things, the thing about 2 men running away from various witnesses. There's so many things that didn't make any sense. I had learned a decade before working on the case that there were in 1981, there were 3 federal investigations going on from the U.S. Attorney's Office, FBI investigations, to deal with police, cop, and mob connections and doing various types of corruption, which had to do with prostitution, had to do with drugs, it had to do with gambling, it had to do a whole number of things. And this was originally, and this was all in the papers, this was wasn't released at the time, it didn't begin to come out until 1983, but they were going on in 1981. And I had known about that and, kept that in mind, and it raised certain questions. And when I had seen Arnold Beverly for the first time, which was in 1989, he had told me that he had been paid to do the shooting, but he didn't do the shooting. He told me there was more than one person in Billy Cook's car. He described what that person was like. He described, which didn't fit the instincts of anybody else, and wasn't Mumia, and that Mumia came running later, and that he himself, he had not done the shooting because other people had come and done the shooting, so he didn't do it. And he furthermore said, I will never tell the story in court at all. So quite frankly, just to be very honest with you, nobody wants to actually defend somebody who's a former Black Panther Party by coming in the first instance and saying, well, let me tell you the real story. It was really a conspiracy to kill the cop between the mob and the FBI. You really don't want to have to go there. And I didn't want to really go there either, though I kept that in the back of my mind, and I certainly investigated as much as possible, what things, and it kept my mind open as I followed the evidence and saw different things. I do want to say that in some ways the truth is the best way to defend a criminal case, however wild it may seem. And I can tell you that there's nothing that you see on TV or you see in the movies that actually matches what goes on in real life, vis-a-vis the cops, vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis these types of things. Nothing matches actually what goes on in real life. You cannot. So anyway, so what did Arnold Beverly, so what do we know? We knew there was an investigation going on. We knew there were problems with it. So Arnold Beverly, who I hadn't told anything about the green jackets, he said he was wearing a green jacket that night. Ken Freeman, I talked to Billy Cook, got an affidavit from Mumia's brother, who said that his friend Ken Freeman was involved in killing the cop. And basically we knew, we had all this different evidence that there was something that was involved with killing this cop that was set up in a way that this gave a lot of plausibility to this. We also knew and learned that there was a FBI confidential police informant for this investigation by the feds. And we learned from talking to people, as much as they would say, that in fact the confidential informant had brothers who were cops. Faulkner had brothers who were cops. We also know that Faulkner was a real go-getter. He was trying to get ahead with everything. This is the type of thing he did. In doing this work, I consulted also former FBI agents. I mean, it wasn't like this all coming out of my head, getting expertise. I had no expertise in this particular area here of what would make sense, how a murder would go on, and basically a lot of these things fit. A couple other things just to make this picture. Basically, the cop who was the senior person on the scene that night, the inspector, was a guy named Alfonso Giordano. He was the inspector. That's the third highest rank in the Philadelphia Police Department. Giordano was best bud's right-hand man to Rizzo. Giordano was the guy who led this assault on the students trying to change the name of Benjamin Franklin High School to Martin Luther King High School. Giordano was the head of the Stakeout Squad, which is the name of a SWAT team in Philadelphia that does the raids on the Panther Party. He was the guy who led the Panther Party, the raid back in 1968 in
when
Philadelphia.
Made people strip.
Made them strip, yes. And then also he was the guy who was in charge of the division that actually oversaw the blockade and barricade of the MOVE compound in 1978. I mean, Philadelphia in that way is sort of a small town. There's no big division between the cops who are corrupt, the cops who are the Red Squad and worse. It's all the same guys in a lot of ways. And this is who Giordano was. He certainly knew who Mumia was personally. Now, one of the people we spoke to and reached in the course of trying to check out what happened with these federal cases was in fact the informant that worked for the FBI. He was a guy who ran his own set of prostitution houses, and he was doing deals. He had to pay off the cops, and at a certain point they gave him a hard time, and so he basically wound up, and he was under other problems, so he wound up being contacted by the FBI. I think he went to the FBI, and they employed him, gave him to actually be an informant, and he had wires on, and he did stuff. And this was all in the period of time. This was from like about November 1981 to like March of 1982. His information that he provided the FBI led to not just the indictment, but the conviction of some 25 cops in Philadelphia. So this is not just something he said, it's verified in that way. He said to us that in fact, he had heard at the time that there was a Philadelphia cop from the 6th District, which is where all this happened, who was working with the feds, so they had to be careful when they do all their dealings. Because a lot of the targets, in fact, were these guys from the Central Division, the downtown area, the 6th District. That's who they were being gone after. And also the fact was that he said that he had been asked to go. He was also a guy that did a lot of wiretapping himself. He did a lot of bad things. I don't want to go through the things he did. Worked for all these horrible juntas and South, all this stuff. Any event, he was asked to do a sweep of the offices, because they were worried about bugs from the feds, the cops were, in the division office of this guy named Giordano, Alfonso Giordano. And so Giordano had asked him to do this, and basically this guy, Donald Hersing, joked and said that Giordano said to him, "Oh, I bet you're working for the feds," and everything like that. So Giordano's name had been passed on to the feds before the shooting ever happened, okay, of Mumia. And he was named as a corrupt cop. That's very important. Last other point I want to make as I'm tying this together, a couple of points. We show the radio runs of the case and of what the radio runs of the police as they reported what was happening. And very important to know that there's basically 14 minutes of radio runs. The story from the DA's office is Mumia was found on the scene by the cops immediately, within like a minute and a half from the time that Faulkner calls in and says, I'm stopping a van, stopping a car, sending a van, which means he was looking for two people, not one. That's in the way it works. And in that minute and a half, Mumia is supposedly found by the arriving police officers, who were not the people who were supposed to go to the scene. They were other people, by the way. And within a few minutes after that, within another minute and a half, there were 5 cop cars there, 11 police officers. Within 3 minutes, there were 11 and 15, and Giordano was there. What Giordano did on the scene was, he is the guy that found the, quote, witness, one of the prostitutes, to identify Mumia, who by that time had been smashed up, shot, smashed around in the van. And he said also that Mumia confessed to him that night. Here's what Mumia supposedly said. Mumia said, because Mumia had a gun holster, and at that point it was empty. He had a gun holster because he had a legally bought gun that he bought when he'd been robbed as a cab driver, and he'd had it. There was no secret about that. So Giordano reported, oh, I asked Mumia where his gun was, and he said, oh, I threw it on the ground right after I shot the cop. Okay. Now, in addition to that,
Feel safe?
He said, huh? Yeah. And then basically, and the other thing was the gun. Now, the gun that supposedly was right there on the scene was not reported in these radio runs for 11 minutes. So how did that happen? Why would not have been reported in? And in fact, one of the things that's on the radio run is a notice, a call out to say, all cars who are coming, because there's this thing, cop down, cop down, cop down, it goes on. They say, we heard, you should follow the car with the gun in it, and the shooter, we think, has gone off in X direction. So don't come here to the scene, go away someplace else. Now that was the cops who knew on the scene what was going to happen, basically telling anybody else who was not involved to leave. I've seen the pictures. I didn't have a chance to bring you all the pictures of what the cops on the scene looked like. You can see one of the police officers holding the gun, supposedly the shooting gun in his hand without anything on it. You can see how they're all looking. You can see whatever. You can see that they doctored the scene by moving Faulkner's cap someplace, a whole lot of things. But the point being is, there was an attempt, I believe, from everything I've learned about the case over many years, and lots of documentation and many memos about this in a binder this high, and each aspect of what Beverly had to say, that gives substantial support that he was fundamentally telling the truth when he said the things he did, and the other things. I mean, there also were other cops who were there on the scene, this last other point, who were there undercover. They were acting like one guy acted like he was just homeless, another guy acted like he was alcoholic, and the minute the first shots happened, they're out there with their guns. And we had this from other independent witnesses. So the point is that there were cops on the scene, I believe, and I think I know, but I can't prove who the cops were who were there. Mumia has said that he knows he was shot by a uniformed cop, but he does not know, can't say it was Faulkner. He had for years presumed it was Faulkner because that he was told, but he was shot and in shock and almost died that night, and he just knows he was shot by a cop. Beverly said he was shot by a cop who was there waiting to identify the scene, and Beverly said he himself was shot by the cops from behind, because there were other cops around to make sure this all happened. Okay, so the point about all of this is that this was a pure unadulterated frame-up. It was two things at once. It was Mumia, who they knew who he was, who sort of messed up what was intended to be, this shooting between other people, because I also learned by what Billy Cook had to say and from his pal Ken Freeman and another witness who I talked to also, that in fact there were two sets of shooters, which is in fact how they very often set up mob shooting. You have two sets of guys, don't know what's going to go on, both said to do something at basically the same time. And in this case, they were all blacks. And I didn't realize this, but the mob used a lot of black people. There wasn't this big division, this the Italian mob versus, other who would do stuff. But they did a lot of the dirty work and everything for them. So I got confirmation of these different teams of people and how it worked and whatever. So the point of all this is that when Mumia's trial, winding up this, when Mumia went on trial, Giordano, who remember I said that Mumia confessed to him, and he was the main person in all the press from the police about Mumia. He sort of disappeared, sort of from public view in February, and during the course of the investigation learned that he had been removed in February, after the shooting was in December, removed from his command post, big command post as an inspector, and put doing desk duty in an administrative office. And he retired with full pay the first working day after Mumia's death sentence. The first working day. That's when he resigned. And though the admissibility of this confession was agreed to by Judge Sabo, because they had to have a hearing on it to say, well, is this admissible? There were no Miranda rights. Was this spontaneous? Can this go in? He said, sure, it can go in. But there was no supposed confession made by Mumia testified to at Mumia's trial. Instead, they presented, which Mumia had no knowledge about until really the trial began, that supposedly Mumia had confessed in the hospital, and there were two hospital guards that were going to come and say that Mumia said, I killed the cop and glad he died and all the other stuff. The actual record showed that according to what the lying documents that they showed, there were actually 7 supposed confessions that Mumia made to about a dozen different nurses and guards in the hospital at different stages of his treatment. Okay, so what do you say about this? What do you say about the fact? Okay, wrapping up, get me in. So basically, the point being is, Giordano did not testify. He was left the police department. It turns out he was, 2 years later, a whole bunch of cops from that same division were higher ups. These are all higher up guys. Were indicted for various types of corruption and everything. Giordano was not indicted until 1985. And in 1985, when he was indicted, he was given probation. He was the only one of these cops, of these 25 cops, that didn't get a jail sentence. He got that. So I waited until 1985 to do that. And so we had been pondering in our legal case back now in 95, before we had done all this investigation and knew all this. In 95, I didn't know all this, learned this over the course of some years later, that why was this hospital confession invented? And why didn't they put Giordano on the stand? Like, why? We couldn't figure it out. So once I learned all these things, here's my supposition, which I think is the only thing that makes sense. Giordano was under investigation. The FBI knew he was under investigation. They knew, and the Attorney General's office knew, that Giordano was the prime police witness against Mumia for the confession, for the witnesses, what happened at the scene and all over. And therefore, they weren't going to risk, and this is how I think it is, they were not going to risk Mumia's conviction. nor did they particularly want to bring forward that they had this investigation going on, but I'm sure their primary concern is they didn't want to muck with Mumia's likely conviction, given what was going on or what they were trying to do. So what they did, and the only way it could have happened, is the Attorney General, Philadelphia, notified. Who would he notify? District Attorney Edward Brundell. I mean, who else would you notify to say, guess what? Your lead witness against Mumia Abu-Jamal is under investigation for corruption. You know what? The best thing to do is get him out of the trial and do that. And that's what they did, and that's why they invented the hospital confession. Okay, so despite the fact that here are all these things, and there's more that I haven't been able to, explain, though I know I've taken a lot of time to do this. My position about the Beverly evidence has been the following, and I call it the Beverly evidence because it's not just his confession of the shooting, but it's all the attendant other evidence, most of which, or a lot of which I've gone through here. The Beverly evidence exposes that this frame-up exposes the American bourgeois legal system, and it shows how much there's a unity of purpose between the cops, the prosecution, and the courts. And that is what it's all about. It exposes anyone wanting to argue that Mumia's conviction was based on one bad cop or a few bad cops or DA who wasn't good or one horrific judge, even though he was a horrific judge, and I'm going to spend a little time on that. All of that was the case. But it's sort of, you can't, and part of the reason why this evidence didn't come out, because we had this evidence in 1999. We had an opportunity to file that in court before Mumia's federal habeas corpus action was filed again later in October of '99, and would have actually been a whole thing. And it would have been, in my mind, an explosive piece of evidence that would sort of cut across a whole lot of things. And combined with what at that point, remember, 1989, this was happening, this investigation was happening literally at the moments that 1999 Millions for Mumia demonstrations were being organized. In fact, I was there for the lie detector test of Arnold Beverly in San Francisco Bay Area on April 24th, 1999, for various reasons. That's where we wound up doing it. And so here is a point when the highest points of people mobilizing for Mumia, the April 24th demonstration, 1999, you saw the little video of that. Did you see the video?
No, we're going to show it as soon as you're finished.
Okay, fine. Well, you'll see it. But you'll know all around the world, these were the largest demonstrations for Mumia. Okay, so Leonard Weinglass, who was revered as one of the last of the, lefty lawyers and stuff, quashed this. He would not put this evidence into court. Would not put this evidence into court. He refused to do that. We had a huge battle about this. He would not do this because it felt it wasn't, it was respectable, really, because it wasn't respectable. It wasn't believable. It wasn't believable. It wasn't respectable. He wasn't going to put his name to this. He wasn't going to be there if Billy Cook said there was another person in the car. He refused to do this. This is all in a written affidavit, what I'm telling you now, which is filed in court. It's available to read elsewhere, actually on my webpage. And he refused to do that. He also, the other reason he refused to do it is because that the defense team and him personally had been threatened with, by the FOP, that they would be killed, if something happened. We'd heard there was a hit put on all the attorneys, way back when. But in any event, but primarily, I want to say it was primarily political. It was political because it was viewed to be too hot, too much of an indictment of this unity of purpose of the criminal justice system to put on this evidence. I'm not saying that's consciously said it that way, but that's why. That's why. Now, I left I resigned, and so did my lawyer from the Partisan Defense Committee who was working. We worked closely together on this case, and we were another pole within the defense team in a whole lot of other fights about other evidence of innocence and how to get that in, and which were resisted. But at this point, when Weinglass, who was lead attorney, refused to put that into court, I resigned because I could not be a party at that point to suppressing this evidence of Mumia's innocence. And if anything, if it had gotten to the point of a death, I would have done something about it, but I could not do that, and I did not, disclose to other people the fact that this was going on. And it did not get disclosed until this information came out in other ways, and Mumia got new attorneys. He fired Len Weinglass and Daniel Williams, who was the other attorney on the case, fired them for, sort of breach of confidence, putting out a book called
Executing Justice.
Executing Justice, which actually is a whole chapter on how outrageous the Senator Beverly stuff was, even though nobody knew about it. I mean, I had not disclosed it to other people outside our legal team. And so in fact, that book written was used by the prosecution and accepted by the judge to say, oh, this evidence is too late because Len Weinglass obviously knew about it 2 years earlier, so we're not going to put this into thing. All right, so I'm just going to do the last couple of things, huh?
Castillo.
Yes, I'm getting there. Okay, are you all bored? Do you want me to say?
No, sorry, Joe.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I can see their faces. Nobody's walked out yet. Nobody's being whatever. So I'm going to finish the last 2 points, okay? One is about what you were told was going to be the main point here, besides my headline, which is going to be the current update on what's happening in the case. All right, so I went through a lot about prosecutorial misconduct, the police, and whatever. I haven't talked a lot of judicial misconduct. So first, you need to know that when we had the hearing with Mumia, this judge we had, Judge Sabo, infamous, king of death row, Mumia and I had 2 favorite things that Judge Sabo said during the course of the outrageous things he did while denying us any subpoenas, any information, all sorts of stuff. I was arrested in the courtroom for saying Your Honor to him, really, because I wanted him to explain why he suppressed something. He threatened, he fined Len Weinglass $1,000 for not moving quickly enough. Another point, his behavior was denounced in the bourgeois papers for making it appear unfair. Nonetheless, everybody perfectly thought in the end the decisions were right. Okay, so 2 favorite things that we knew at the time in '95. Judge Sabo once said, when there was an argument about, what was correct on our part for one of the lawyers raising stuff, and said, Counselor, justice is just an emotional feeling. That was one of our favorites. The other one was a little more serious. That's the judge. The other one is a little more serious. And this is when we were arguing for a stay of execution. When we did this Post-Conviction Relief Act, this is a whole other story. I'm not going to go into the whole other story. The Department of Corrections. No, we're not getting there yet. The judge had. We were operating under a warrant of execution. Mumia was scheduled to be executed on August 17th. We started this hearing. We tried to get a stay, saying, "Look, we're arguing this case. We do it. He would not give the stay. He would not give the stay. He would not give the stay." And we filed papers, and when we filed the papers for the stay, the standard for getting a stay generally in sort of an injunction in law generally is you have to show irreparable harm. And Judge Sabo said, "Counselors, having a death warrant is not irreparable harm." Yeah, it's in writing. It's in the paper. Yeah, I'm serious. So a year ago, there was a decision called Williams versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in the United States Supreme Court in June of 2016 that for the first time ever in the history of the United States, the Supreme Court ruled it is a violation of due process and of the necessity of impartiality in the judiciary for a judge who was previously personally involved in a significant prosecutorial decision to actually sit as a judge. Meaning, you can't be a prosecutor, actually taking a personal interest in a case, and then become a judge and sit in judgment of this case.
Of your own case.
Oh, no, of the same case. Of the
Yes,
same case,
yes.
right. That is a bias and conflict of interest. Okay, the judge involved was this guy, Ronald Castile. Ronald Castile was the district attorney in Pennsylvania when Mumia's whole appeal process went through. Okay, he wasn't the judge, he wasn't the prosecutor. Rendell was the prosecutor during the trial, but Castile was the prosecutor during the appeal. He was responsible for being an architect, defending, overseeing all the different legal responses from the DA's office going to the court. And then when the same issues got raised again and more issues got raised again in the appeals court, Castile denied all of them. While the original first appeals from the 95 Sabo stuff were going on, which went to the court in 96, we made a motion for Castile to recuse himself back then, in 96, saying that he supports the FOP supports him. He had bragged about the fact he put 45 people on death row, all those different things. Castile didn't respond until 1998, when simultaneously with the issuance of the denial of all Mumia's appeals, Castile wrote a whole long decision saying, oh, he has no bias, whatever. And then he made a point, which is actually true. He said, well, if you want to say I should recuse myself because I get support from the FOP, well, you know what? There's 5 other justices sitting on the Supreme Court bench out of 7 who all get support from the FOP. Right. So he didn't do that. This had been tried for a long time. In 2002, when Elliot Grossman was the lawyer, he raised another thing for Castile to recuse himself. He refused at that time, too. So with this new decision in 2016 involving the very same judge, basically new legal papers were filed for Mumia in August of 2016. And they say, this is who Castile is, this is who, Castile's role was, and they demanded evidence from the DA's files to substantiate that he had a personal involvement in Mumia's case. There was, much to my surprise, the judge did not dismiss it because the DA made a very strong argument. It couldn't be done, it was, too late, too whatever, it didn't apply to him, blah, 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 blah. The judge did not dismiss it. It went on, and he ordered the DA's office to supply information. There have been 4 orders from the judge for the DA to supply information. They have only supplied things that are part of the public record. They did turn over some 31 boxes of files on Mumia's case, and the judge, not to the defense attorneys or publicly or anything, but for the judge to view in camera, which means in secret. And then also they've come up with a couple of things that they say they didn't have before, but now they've had. After saying over and over again, we've looked in all our files, we don't have anything. And there is now a document that shows that Castile was very interested in all the death penalty cases on his watch at this particular time in 1990, which is when Mumia's case was going to the Supreme Court of the United States. And he said specifically to the governor of Pennsylvania, who's the guy who issues the execution warrants, he said, I'm urging you to basically issue execution warrants immediately to these 16 cases, and he names these cases. They do not include Mumia, because Mumia's case wasn't eligible for a death warrant at that point because his case was before the Supreme Court. But Castile says, I particularly want you to make this point that we mean the death sentence very seriously, and in particular where somebody has been accused of killing a cop, which of course fits Mumia. So I believe this is an opening, but I want to make it clear, nobody should ever say the DA is complying with anything, because those documents that we need are there somewhere. They will have to drag stuff out of them tooth and nail, and it will probably be some combination between luck, persistence, and their arrogance that somebody releases something they don't want to have released. They are going to fight this every way precisely because of who Mumia is. Okay, so that's where we are on that. It's going to take international mobilization to win Mumia's freedom, regardless of what's going on in the courts. I want to make the point that this fight, and this is why it's a fight against racist American capitalism, cannot be done on the basis that there's any justice in the court, or you're going to get help from bourgeois politicians, or the federal court judge, or a so-called reformed DA, or that the Justice Department under anybody, including Obama, which people tried before, including Clinton, who people tried before, are going to open up an investigation. They are responsible for Mumia's conviction as much as those cops and Ed Rendell. So it's very important and critical that there be international labor defense and mass mobilizations of every person who feels the need to fight against this wretched, horrible, vicious, capitalist, racist system. And that requires a lot more than us in the room. It requires expanding this fight, and it means understanding that the state is going to fight Mumia's, any attempt for Mumia to be free with all that it has, and it has a lot more forces than we have, unless we actually are able to mobilize internationally. A few good strikes in Philadelphia of transit, of communication, of sanitation would help a lot, as well as other places. I'm not saying that this is happening now, but those are the things we need to fight for. Okay, thank you very much.
To encapsulate in just a couple minutes what Rachel was saying, we're going to show you a video of the Longshore Union.
All right. All right, that was then. This is now. Before you leave, please look at, excuse me. Before you leave, please look at, we have his Mumia Abu-Jamal's latest book. He's right there. Make a nice Christmas gift for somebody. You know, I'm serious.
Veronica Jones' book, too.
And well, I like his latest book. Is right there. Look at them all. Get them all. Yeah. We also accept donations. Obviously, we need to hire us some help around here. But we could use some donations, folks. But most of all, we need you. And I'm not talking about just this evening. I thank everyone for coming this evening. But we're going to try to institute monthly meetings for people to bring some young folks around here. It ain't going to happen by itself. You know, people like to snivel and whine. Oh, the corporate media won't do this. Oh, they don't put this on the idiot box. Well, listen here. The corporate media can't stop you from talking to your children, to your co-workers, to the people you go to school with. You understand? You have some power in all this. So we're going to start. Please sign the list. Leave it. Give us your email if you want to be contacted. And we're going to try to institute monthly meetings to rebuild this movement. And I want to thank you all for coming.
The last point on the agenda is actually questions for Rachel or anyone up here, or statements that you want to make about the Mumia case. Donna?
Another thing about, I think it was Castile who made that horrible video about how to keep black people off the jury.
Yeah.
And that's a very important point, that was hidden, and it was...
Right. Okay, so there was a decision in 1986 called the Batson decision, in which it was said for the first time that you cannot keep black people off a jury, that is a violation of one's right to a jury of your peers. You cannot discriminate. And this was a big deal because the question of racial discrimination and selection of jurors was an issue all the time. It was raised all the time. So anyway, the DA's office under Castile, one of the first things he did when he got into office in '86 was have a video training tape prepared for prosecutors in which they were explained how to pick a juror that actually excluded black jurors and got around the Batson decision and how to hide that information by using coded language and other ways to keep black people off the jury. So he was responsible for that. This was one of the main issues in Mumia's appeal when Castile was a DA and fighting and representing the state of Pennsylvania in opposition to Mumia's challenge on the basis of Batson. He hid the fact there was this videotape. The videotape showed a pattern and policy of discrimination. It would have been evidence in favor of Mumia at the time of his appeal. It came up again later. It was hidden again. It only came out sort of a crazy way between the various people running for the DA's office, which one of the DAs said, oh, by the way, my opponent is the guy who was actually in this video, a guy named Jack McMahon, and he shouldn't be there because he did this horrible thing. Castile said, this is in 1997, 11 years later. We tried to get this as a new hearing based upon this. Castile and other people on the Supreme Court, because he was there on the time, denied that, said he had nothing to do with it. So it's another example of judicial misconduct all through the whole system.
When has Mumia been getting the Hep C medicine since?
He's through with it now. He's done his 12-week course. He's formally said he doesn't have the Hep C virus anymore, but as was said already, he not only has cirrhosis of the liver, he has very bad skin problem, which is still, I think, a secondary symptom of the Hep C. It has not healed itself. He is very uncomfortable. He has to they're giving him Xarelto twice a day, which has other side effects to it. He's still all scabby and itchy. He knocks him down in Vaseline 3 times a day. Much worse than that. I mean, I saw him, his skin was like alligator skin. I mean, really, it's not quite that bad anymore. It's all discolored, but he had open wounds from it, everything like that. He's still, so he has all these different problems still, and he's still in agonizing pain. And a point that was made already, by Gerald, is they want to kill him now. They haven't stopped trying to kill him, and that's why we need to get him out.
Stan?
Yeah, I forget his name. There is a left liberal, how we describe him, defense attorneys running for DA in
That's what I'm
Philadelphia.
talking about, Larry Krasner.
Yeah, I believe the election's next week.
Yes. Yeah.
Has Mumia's case come up in his campaign, either him defending
He won't
Mumia?
say anything about it.
Has he been attacked implicitly?
No,
the FOP?
he's attacked explicitly for being, a Sanders. He is a Sanders supporter, supported by the Sanders campaign and the Soros Fund and a whole bunch of other people as a reformed DA. He is somebody who's done only criminal defense work for years and years and years. He wants to reform the DA's office, do this, and this. You can't reform the DA's office under Capitalism. I know you're not saying. He has been asked to say something about it. He won't say anything about it. Rendell has made it clear that he does not want Krasner to be the next DA, even though he won the Democratic primary hand over fist, and it's a Democratic city. Castile, however, ran as a Republican, and he won, years ago, by the way. But Rendell has said he doesn't want him. The Philadelphia Inquirer has denounced him for doing so. It remains to be seen, as far as I'm concerned, whether or not Krasner will be elected. And even if he is, and even if he is in his heart of hearts a reformed DA, he is not going to reform the DA's office. I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm saying this for everybody. The FOP will go on strike against him. They've done that before. And furthermore, to the extent that Krasner wants to do any good in the DA's office for anybody, the last people he's going to do anything for is going to be Mumia Abu-Jamal or the MOVE prisoners. The last people. Because if he has any intention of surviving in that city, the last people he's going to do that. And there are people in Philadelphia who should know better that are all thinking, this guy's going to come in, he says he's going to open files, he's going to make all this happen. No way.
Well, quick follow-up, even though he hasn't said he defends Mumia or what's
No, he hasn't said anything about it.
Has FOP implied that he has that FOP made Mumia issue in the election?
Not that I know of, but he's always there. I mean, there's no such thing as not, because Krasner hasn't said anything. But believe me, the minute Krasner removes these career DAs, I didn't get a chance to say, the same DAs that prosecuted Mumia under Rendell, the very same people are still the people opposing Mumia today. There is a longevity here. It's not like Geronimo Pratt's case, where at least those guys were dead. That's how one of the reasons Geronimo got out, because the main people against him were gone. They were irrelevant. They are alive and well. Not only Giordano, who's still alive, but Rendell. And Rendell has a lot of power, and I'll be very surprised if Krasner even wins.
Any more questions out there or
Yeah, I got a
statements?
question.
Go ahead.
When I was reading about the case in the 90s, I read something and I've been trying to find it again, and I haven't been able to find it, which leads me to believe it was either a rumor or maybe it's been buried. And what I read was that the gun that was recovered and the bullets that were recovered at the scene were of a different caliber.
Yeah.
And they were trying to review them, or review this, and the bullets turned up missing from the evidence.
I don't know. I don't know if they're missing from the evidence room. I mean, I saw the bullets in 1995. I did see them, and we wanted to have them tested, but they wouldn't allow them out of the homicide division's thing to have them independently tested. They are all different. In fact, there's too few bullets there. They don't make any sense. That's a whole other thing I didn't go through. They do not make any sense, the bullets that are there. The bullet that they said that killed Faulkner, it does not, they said it was degraded and you couldn't tell what it is. It's a perfectly formed bullet. You know, I mean, but we haven't been able to test it.
But is it, did they say it doesn't match the gun, or is it a completely different caliber?
Well, they say it does match the gun. The DA's office says it does match the gun, and it is, you know, it is similar to Mumia's gun. It happens to be that particular 38 and those bullets, I think it was Smith & Wesson, that basically, you know, hundreds of thousands of guns could have shot that particular bullet. I mean, everything they say about it is wrong. I never heard that they were missing. I saw the ballistics evidence such as it was in 90 and 95. I can tell you one of the things when I did my work and it got into the stuff is there's a bullet fragment that is listed in the autopsy report of Faulkner that is disappeared. That's what you're thinking of. There is a missing bullet fragment. What it came from, how big it is, whether it matches the fragments and the bullet pieces are there or not, never been able to figure out because we never got a copy of the autopsy report. We never were able to independently test this stuff.
Oh dear.
The way I read it, you tell me, was that okay, Mumia's gun is a 38 caliber gun, but the cop was shot with a 44 caliber bullet.
Okay,
That's the way I heard it. I don't know.
okay. On the autopsy, we raised that in the hearing. On the autopsy report, on the front cover of it says shot with a 45. There's no 44. There's no 44 as part of the ballistics evidence. To the best that I could do, just telling it to you straight, I could not, and I've seen the pictures. I have the pictures of Faulkner being shot right between the face. I've seen them. I brought them to ballistics experts, and there was nothing from what they saw and did that would show that that was a 44. There are a lot of unanswered questions here. Why would that be said? I mean, there are other things too I can tell you, but these are all good questions. Because basically in 95, I mean, again, I don't want to sound like there's a political reason, actually, why I found certain things. I found that 44 thing on the front of the thing. I found the missing fragment in this thing. Other lawyers didn't find it. Len Weinglass didn't find that. And the reason he didn't find it because he wasn't looking for anything that showed Mumia was innocent. It's really that simple. I'm not so smart. I didn't know nothing about ballistics and all the other stuff. But I knew that Mumia was innocent, and I knew that it was a frame-up because I understood what the case was all about, so I had my eyes open. And one thing for all the people out there that you may have heard who say, this Beverly evidence, because this is what Dan Williams wrote in this book, that I was just following my politics, all the stuff about a frame. I'm just following my politics, that what I had to say about the case, including Arnold and Beverly, was my political position. No, actually, I am the lawyer that followed the evidence. I followed the evidence in this case, both what was there and what wasn't there. Who followed and had a political agenda to not show there was a frame-up were those guys. Ultimately, the hero, Len Weinglass, the other guy who was a protege, by the way, of Dershowitz, sort of enough said, and basically, and all the other lawyers that don't want to deal with the evidence. And for the movement people that wanted not use the Beverly evidence, that is politics. It's not legal. And, you know, I could say in this way, in some ways, this is maybe very provocative, Mumia would have been better off with a mob lawyer at some instance. Why? Because mob
case.
Well, no, because mob lawyers know the state is always lying.
Right.
Yeah.
They know it's all a fraud.
Right.
They know it's all a facade.
Right.
They know they lie to get convictions. They know all that stuff. But when you have, this is part of the problem with political lawyers, because some of these they want to, this is a thing about liberalism and left lawyers who are not true economists, proving the inviolability of the capitalist state. You cannot actually attack the underpinnings of the justice system, because it's an attack on actually the function of the capitalist state. And those are the points I'm trying to make here, and the connections to be made. So never trust that the DA has complied. Never think that the judge is on your side. Now, if they are, and if they do, great. But don't ever give up the territory because it ain't true.
That's right.
You know, go and ask. You know, go and ask legislators. I've done this. I've lobbied legislators, congressmen. You know, send petitions to people. Do all that stuff, but don't rely on them. Don't expect they're going to do the right thing. Make the demand. That's why every time there's a petition going out and it says, oh, let's ask the DA to investigate this case. Let's ask the no. That's fair enough. No, you don't do that. You demand that they free Mumia. There's only one thing to say, you know, about these files. It's not like people want to say, well, we should ask the DA to. Well, you ask the DA to open and demand and turn over all the police and prosecution files to the public. Everything. That doesn't mean they will, but that's the demand. Not please, Missy, whatever we're doing, and free Mumia.
That's right.
And free Mumia, because there's nothing else that will save that man's life except being freed. And the demand is to only and ever be that demand. Whatever else you say.
Okay, let's thank Rachel one last time for coming out here.
I have a request from the Labor Action Committee. When you have your monthly meetings, like I